Their dog, abandoned and buried in the desert, due to a trivial mistake, fights for its life. When everything seems lost, a simple act of courage reveals a secret capable of changing everything. The rising sun bathed the vast lands of Bradford Ranch in golden light. While most residents of the small Texas town of Riverdale were still asleep, Ethan Bradford was already contemplating his domain from the veranda of his mansion, a glass of whiskey in hand, despite the early hour. At 28, the heir to the Bradford oil empire had everything: money, power, and the ability to bend anyone to his will. "Mr. Ethan, your breakfast is served," announced Margaret, the housekeeper who had served him since childhood. Without responding, he merely nodded. His ice-cold blue eyes remained fixed on the horizon. At that moment, a small caramel-colored mutt approached, wagging its tail enthusiastically. It was Buddy, the only living being that seemed to awaken any affection in Ethan's hardened heart. "Come here, boy," he said, in a rare moment of tenderness, stroking the dog's head. "At least you've never disappointed me." That same morning, a few miles away in the outskirts of Riverdale, young Charlie was waking up in his modest home. At 12 years old, the boy with an easy smile and curious eyes lived with his parents, Anthony and Mary, former employees of Bradford Ranch, who had been fired when Ethan decided to modernize his operations. "Charlie, breakfast's on the table," shouted Mary from the kitchen while preparing lunchboxes to sell at the market. "Coming, Mum," replied the boy, quickly pulling on a worn t-shirt. Anthony, seated at the table, was reading the local newspaper with a worried expression. "Bradford Oil expands operations concerning environmentalists," said the headline. "It's a disgrace. What that family does. They destroy everything, treat people like garbage, and still get treated like royalty," Anthony vented. "Keep your voice down, Anthony," warned Mary, glancing at their son. "Charlie doesn't need to grow up with that hatred." "It's not hatred, Mary, it's justice we want." Charlie listened in silence. Though young, he understood his father's resentment. After 15 years dedicated to the ranch, Anthony had been replaced by machines without fair compensation. The family had barely managed to keep their small house in the area. On the other side of town, in the most imposing building in the region, Diana Reynolds was organizing her notes. A journalist recently arrived from New York. She had been hired by the small local newspaper with a mission few would dare accept: investigating the practices of the Bradford Empire. "You're new around here, so I'll give you some advice," said the editor, Gerald, a gray-haired gentleman. "Be careful what you write about this family. They control everything, from the mayor to the sheriff." Diana smiled confidently. "That's exactly why I came here, Gerald. The most important stories are those that few have the courage to tell." Meanwhile, at the ranch, Ethan was receiving a visit from his father, August Bradford, a 65-year-old man whose severe expression rarely softened. The family patriarch had accumulated his fortune by exploiting oil in environmental protection areas, using his political influence to circumvent laws and silence opponents. "We need to talk about this weekend's party," announced August, entering his son's luxurious office. "I've invited all the politicians and businessmen we need to approve the new concession in the Everglades." "Leave it to me, Dad. It'll be unforgettable," replied Ethan, a calculating smile forming on his lips. "When they leave here, they'll be so impressed they'll sign any paper we put in front of them." Buddy, lying at his master's feet, lifted his head as if sensing something. In the simplicity of his animal instinct, perhaps he was the only one who perceived the storm forming on Riverdale's horizon. The preparations for the party at Bradford Ranch set all of Riverdale in motion. Florists, decorators, and renowned chefs arrived in convoys of luxury vehicles, bringing the most exclusive products in the country. For many local residents, this activity represented temporary work, a rare opportunity to earn extra money. Among those hired was Mary, Charlie's mother, who had secured a position on the catering team. Anthony hadn't approved of the idea. "I don't want you working for those people again," he protested, while fixing the old refrigerator that kept giving them trouble. "Anthony, it's just one day of work, and the payment equals 2 weeks of selling." "Lunchboxes," argued Mary, with the determination that characterized her. I'm not working for them, I'm working for us." Meanwhile, Charlie was playing in the backyard with his dog Thunder, a black mutt he had adopted a few months ago. The boy couldn't hide his curiosity about the party. "Mom, can I go with you tomorrow?" he asked, entering the kitchen with eyes shining with hope. Mary smiled, ruffling her son's hair. "No way, young man, that place is not for children, especially during a party." On the morning of the big event, the ranch transformed into a fairy tale setting, with lights, exotic flowers, and temporary structures that looked like palaces. Ethan personally supervised every detail, always accompanied by Buddy, who faithfully followed him. "If anything goes wrong, tonight there will be consequences," he threatened the event manager, who merely nodded nervously. In the afternoon, as the final preparations were being completed, Charlie couldn't resist the temptation. Evading surveillance, he snuck in through the back of the ranch, hiding among bushes and busy workers. His plan was simple: to see up close the ostentation he had heard so much about and, perhaps, score some sweets from the party. As night fell, guests began to arrive. Influential politicians, powerful businessmen and celebrities paraded in their gala attire and gleaming jewels. Among them, discreetly, was Diana, the journalist. She had secured an invitation through a contact at the newspaper and now carefully observed each interaction, each whisper exchanged in corners. "Impressive how oil money flows so easily, isn't it?" commented a voice beside her. Diana turned and found a middle-aged man with kind eyes that contrasted with the environment. "Dr. Edward Sanders," he introduced himself. "I'm an environmental lawyer and, let's say, a black sheep in this flock." "Diana, Reynolds, journalist, and I imagine you're not very welcome here." "Let's say I'm tolerated for now," Edward smiled, "but I'm here for a greater purpose than these canapes." The party reached its peak when August Bradford climbed onto a small stage specially set up for the occasion. All eyes turned to the patriarch, who raised a glass of champagne. "I toast to the future," he proclaimed, a calculating smile on his lips, "to our joint future in this new venture that will bring prosperity to all." The applause was interrupted by a sudden commotion. Buddy, excited by the music and activity, was running among the guests, playing and jumping. In an unfortunate movement, the dog bumped into a waiter, who in turn spilled an entire tray of red wine on Senator Miller, Bradford Oil's main political supporter in Congress. "How outrageous!" exclaimed the senator, his white suit now stained. "Red? This is an insult." Silence fell over the environment. All eyes turned to Ethan, who observed the scene with growing fury. His face, previously smiling, transformed into a mask of hatred. "I apologize profusely, Senator," he said, his voice controlled but his eyes flashing. "We'll provide another suit immediately." As he accompanied the senator into the house, Ethan cast an icy look at the event manager. "Get rid of that dog," he ordered through gritted teeth. "And when I say get rid of, you know exactly what I mean." The manager turned pale but nodded. Charlie, who was watching everything from behind one of the tables, felt a chill run down his spine. There was something sinister in Ethan's look that deeply disturbed him. Mary, working at the buffet, also witnessed the scene. She knew that look well. It was the same one Ethan had cast when he decided to dismiss all the ranch's longtime employees. "My God," she whispered to a colleague, "what is he going to do to the poor thing?" The party continued into the night as if nothing had happened. Artificial laughter and conversations about millions echoed through the illuminated gardens of Bradford Ranch. But behind the scenes, a palpable tension had set in. Carl and Peter, two longtime employees of the property, had been called to Ethan's office as soon as the main guests had left. "You two, take that dog," ordered Ethan, without looking directly at the employees. His voice was as cold as the marble under his feet. "Take him to the desert brushland at least 30 miles from here, dig a hole and bury him." Carl, who had worked at the ranch for more than 20 years, felt his stomach turn. "Bury him, sir, but Buddy is still alive." "Yes, he is, and I want him to stay that way while the earth falls on him," interrupted Ethan, finally turning to face them. His eyes showed no emotion whatsoever. "Is there a problem with that?" The two men exchanged anxious glances. Peter, younger and with a family to support, lowered his head in submission. Carl, however, felt the weight of his years and his conscience. "Sir, forgive me, but I can't do that. Buddy has been with you since you were a child. You're fired." Ethan cut him off without changing his tone of voice. "Leave my property by dawn, Peter. Can you do this alone, or do I need to find someone more competent?" I'll do it, sir," muttered Peter, avoiding Carl's disapproving gaze. Outside the office, hidden by a half-open door, Charlie heard everything with his heart racing. The boy had remained at the ranch after the commotion, hiding from security until he could find a moment to escape. Now he was witnessing a cruelty that his young mind could barely process. Meanwhile, in the party area that was already emptying, Mary was discreetly looking for Buddy. The cook had always had a special affection for the dog, who frequently received food scraps from her hands in the days when she worked there. She found only Margaret, the housekeeper, who was collecting items forgotten by guests. "Margaret, have you seen Buddy?" asked Mary, concern evident in her voice. The housekeeper looked around, making sure no one was watching them, and responded, in a low voice, "The boss ordered Peter to take him away, and from the way he spoke, it's not for a walk." Her eyes were teary. "That boy is getting more like his father every day, only worse. He doesn't have a bit of heart." Mary felt a chill. She knew well the calculated cruelty of the Bradfords. But targeting a defenseless animal was a new level, even for them. In the back garage, Peter was preparing a pickup truck. His hands trembled as he put a shovel in the trunk. Buddy was locked in an improvised cage in the bed of the truck, looking confused and frightened by the unusual treatment. "I'm sorry, Buddy," whispered Peter, running his fingers through the bars. "I have no choice. We always have a choice." Peter turned, startled. Carl was standing there, arms crossed over his chest. "I can't lose this job, Carl. I have 3 kids to feed and debts up to my neck," Peter justified himself, the shame evident on his worn face. "No money is worth the price." "Of your soul," replied the older man, approaching the cage. "Take him out there, dig the hole, but don't bury him. Leave him somewhere he can be found. Ethan will find out. He always finds out. Then pray that someone finds this dog before he discovers it." Peter was silent for a few moments, the internal conflict stamped on his face. Finally he nodded. "All right, but if he asks, you don't know anything about it." Charlie, hidden behind a fuel barrel, was witnessing the conversation with a mixture of fear and determination. As soon as the pickup truck left, screeching through the ranch gates, the boy ran to the bicycle he had hidden in the bushes. "Thunder!" he called as soon as he got home, waking the black dog sleeping on the living room rug. "Come on, we need to follow a pickup truck." Ignoring the late hour and the dangers of the night, Charlie mounted his bicycle and set off, with Thunder faithfully running by his side. The dirt road leading to the brushland desert was difficult even during the day. In darkness, it became an even greater challenge, but the boy was resolute. He would not allow an innocent to suffer from human cruelty. As he pedaled with all his might, the image of Ethan's cold gaze wouldn't leave his mind. How could someone be so insensitive? How could they order such barbarity against a being that had only offered loyalty? The night in the brushland was a cloak of darkness punctuated by distant stars. Peter's pickup was advancing slowly along the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the gloom like sharp knives. In the passenger seat, a half-empty bottle of whiskey, liquid courage for what he was about to do. Why couldn't he just give the dog to someone? Peter muttered to himself, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Why does it have to be like this? In the back, Buddy whimpered softly, feeling every bump on the rough road. The animal, always so cheerful and confident, now trembled, as if sensing the danger. His dark eyes reflected the stars in the Riverdale sky, perhaps for the last time. Miles. Behind, Charlie pedaled with all the strength his skinny legs allowed. Thunder ran alongside him, sometimes ahead, as if understanding the urgency of the situation. The boy followed the tracks of the pickup on the damp earth, guided more by intuition than by sight in the darkness. "Come on, Thunder, faster!" the boy encouraged, sweat running down his face despite the cool night air. After almost an hour of travel, Peter finally stopped the pickup in an isolated location where the brushland opened into a small clearing surrounded by twisted trees. He got out of the vehicle with heavy movements, as if carrying an invisible burden. He opened the back and looked at Buddy, who cowered at the back of the cage. "Let's get this over with," he whispered, pulling the cage out. With the shovel in hand, he began to dig a hole in the hard earth. Each stroke seemed more difficult than the previous one. It wasn't just the resistant soil, it was his conscience weighing on his shoulders. Charlie arrived at the clearing shortly after, hiding behind a thorny bush. His heart almost stopped when he saw the hole that Peter was digging under the weak light of an improvised lantern. Thunder beside him seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, remaining silent against his nature. When the hole reached approximately 3 feet deep, Peter stopped, leaning on the shovel. He looked at Buddy, who was watching him with pleading eyes. "I can't do this," he finally decided, throwing the shovel to the ground. "Ethan can kill me if he wants, but I won't carry this on my conscience." At that moment, a branch was heard breaking. Peter turned abruptly, raising the lantern. "Who's there?" he shouted, fear evident in his voice. Charlie hesitated for an instant, but something inside told him he needed to reveal himself. With surprising courage for his age, he came out from behind the bush, with Thunder glued to his heels. "It's me, Charlie, son of Anthony and Mary," said the boy, his voice trembling but determined. "Please don't bury Buddy. He didn't do anything wrong." Peter was paralyzed, the lantern illuminating the boy's childish face. A mixture of shame and relief took hold of him. "Charlie, what are you doing here, kid? It's dangerous." "I heard everything." "At the ranch," explained Charlie, cautiously approaching. "I know what Mr. Ethan ordered you to do, but you don't have to obey. It's not right." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by crickets and the gentle wind in the vegetation. Peter felt the weight of his moral dilemma reaching a critical point. "If I don't do this, I lose my job," he argued, more to himself than to the boy. "I have a family to support, bills to pay." "My dad lost his job too," replied Charlie, with the wisdom that sometimes only children possess. "But he always says that we can lose everything except our dignity." Peter looked again at Buddy, then at the hole, and finally at Charlie. Something inside him gave way, like a dam that could no longer withstand the pressure. "Take him," he said suddenly, opening the cage. "Take him far away from here. Don't tell anyone it was me who let him go." Buddy hesitantly came out of the cage, still trembling. When he saw Charlie, however, his tail began to wag timidly, as if recognizing a friend amid the chaos. "I'll tell Mr. Ethan I carried out his orders," continued Peter, putting dirt back in the hole to disguise it. "Meanwhile, hide this dog. If they find out he's alive—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Charlie understood the gravity of the situation. With a nod, he called Buddy, who hesitantly approached. Thunder sniffed the newcomer with friendly curiosity. "I'll take care of him, I promise," assured the boy, determination shining in his young eyes. "No one will hurt him." When Peter finished filling the hole, he cast a final glance at the boy, and the 2 dogs already almost invisible in the darkness of the brushland. "Be careful on the way back, Charlie, and may God help us." On the way back, with Buddy and Thunder running alongside his bicycle, Charlie felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He had defied the most powerful man in Riverdale, and now carried a secret that could change everything. The most difficult part, however, was yet to come: how to hide a dog that everyone in town knew. The light of dawn was beginning to color the horizon when Charlie reached the town limits. An idea formed in his mind. There was only one person who could help him now, someone who didn't fear the Bradfords. The sun was already rising when Charlie arrived at the small veterinary clinic behind Dr. Helen's house, a 60-year-old woman who had dedicated her life to the animals of Riverdale. Known for her sharp tongue and unwavering courage, she was the only person in town Charlie imagined capable of standing up to the Bradfords. Exhausted, the boy knocked insistently on the back door. Buddy, now calmer but still visibly debilitated, was panting beside him along with Thunder. "Who's the crazy person knocking on my door at this hour?" grumbled Dr. Helen, opening the door with her grey hair disheveled and glasses askew on her face. Her stern countenance softened when she saw Charlie. "Boy, what happened?" "Dr. Helen, I need your help," explained Charlie breathlessly, pointing to Buddy. "It's Mr. Ethan's dog. He ordered him to be buried alive in the brushland just because he spilled wine on the senator." The veterinarian's eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in horror as she noticed the dirt still clinging to the animal's fur and his debilitated state. "Good Lord!" she exclaimed, kneeling to examine Buddy. "That Ethan Bradford really is a monster. Come in quickly before someone sees you." Inside the simple but immaculately clean clinic, Dr. Helen carefully examined the dog while Charlie narrated the complete story, from the party to the encounter with Peter in the brushland. "You have courage, boy," she commented, administering saline to Buddy. "Few adults would have done what you did." "What's going to happen now, Dr. Helen?" asked Charlie, the adrenaline finally giving way to fear. "If Mr. Ethan finds out—" The veterinarian stood up, a fierce determination in her tired eyes. "He won't find out because we're going to hide Buddy here. And as for you, you should go home before your parents notice your absence," she instructed, caressing the boy's head. "Don't tell anyone about this, not even your parents for now. The fewer people who know, the safer Buddy will be." Charlie nodded, casting one last look at the dog, who now rested on an improvised bed. Something, in his heart, told him that this story was far from over. At Bradford Ranch, Ethan woke up late, with the sun already high. The previous night's party had been a success, despite the small incident. The senator, after a few glasses of rare whiskey, had completely forgotten the incident with the dog and signed all the necessary documents for the new concession in the Everglades. "The dog has been taken care of, sir," informed Peter when questioned, keeping his face expressionless. "Exactly as ordered." Ethan nodded, showing no emotion. Then he turned his attention to the day's newspapers, where the main headline announced, "Bradford Oil obtains license for exploration in preservation area. Environmentalists protest." "Let them protest," he muttered with a satisfied smile. In the end, money always speaks louder. At the local newspaper office, Diana was organizing her notes from the party. As an experienced journalist, she had gathered valuable information about the behind-the-scenes negotiations. But something bothered her, the sudden absence of the dog that always accompanied Ethan. "Gerald, you know Ethan Bradford well, don't?" "You?" she asked the editor. "That caramel-colored dog was always with him. Strange that he disappeared so suddenly." "Better not stir up that hornet's nest, Diana," advised the editor, lowering his voice. "They say Ethan has an unstable temperament." The conversation was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Dr. Edward Sanders, the environmental lawyer Diana had met at the party. "Good morning," he greeted, his face conveying urgency. "We need to talk. In private." Intrigued, Diana followed him to a small meeting room. Edward waited for the door to close before speaking. "I have sources who have informed me about an environmental police operation tomorrow. They're going to inspect Bradford Oil's facilities following reports of contamination of groundwater," he revealed, his voice low but firm. "I've been gathering evidence for months, but we need more. Something that really shakes the immaculate image the Bradfords have built." Diana bit her lip, thoughtful. "I noticed something strange at the party. Ethan's dog, that caramel mutt that never leaves his side, suddenly disappeared after spilling wine on Senator Miller. And from Ethan's expression at that moment," Edward frowned. "You think he might have—" "I don't know, but I intend to find out," affirmed Diana, determined. "If Ethan is capable of cruelty to a defenseless animal that has accompanied him for years, imagine what he would do to people who cross his path." Meanwhile, at Anthony and Mary's house, concern was growing. Charlie had returned at dawn, dirty and exhausted, telling a poorly elaborated story about having gone out early to fish with Thunder. Neither Anthony nor Mary believed it, but they chose not to pressure their son at that moment. "Something's wrong, Anthony," whispered Mary, watching Charlie, who was sleeping deeply on the living room sofa. "He's never lied to us before." "Maybe it has to do with yesterday," replied Anthony, concerned. "Margaret told me about the incident with Ethan's dog. Knowing our son, I wouldn't be surprised if he tried to do something." 3 days had passed, Since the incident in the brushland, Riverdale lived its usual routine, apparently oblivious to the secrets that hid behind respectable facades. At Dr. Helen's clinic, Buddy was slowly recovering, now hidden in a room at the back of the house. The veterinarian took care to keep the windows closed and the curtains always drawn. "You're getting better, little guy," she murmured, changing the bandages on the animal's paws, injured by the desperate digging before the rescue. "Soon you'll be good as new." The silence was broken by soft knocks on the door. It was Charlie, who came to visit Buddy every day after school. "How is he today, Dr. Helen?" asked the boy, sneaking in. "Better, dear, but he's still not strong." "Enough for much excitement," she replied, watching with tenderness when Buddy, recognizing the boy, weakly wagged his tail. Charlie sat next to the dog, gently caressing his head. Something in his demeanor, however, betrayed concern. "What is it, boy? You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," inquired the veterinarian, noticing his restlessness. "It's just... yesterday, when I got back from school, I saw environmental police cars at the ranch. Everyone in town is talking about it. What if they find out about Buddy? What if Mr. Ethan comes looking for him here?" Dr. Helen adjusted her glasses, assuming a serious expression. "Ethan has no idea that Buddy is alive, Charlie. Peter ensured that. As for the police, they're there because of the pollution reports, not because of a dog," she explained slowly. "Besides, there's no use worrying about what we can't control. Let's take care of Buddy and hope that justice is done." At Bradford Oil headquarters, the atmosphere was one of controlled tension. The surprise visit from the environmental police had resulted in a worrying preliminary report, with evidence of chemical contamination in an area near the facilities. Ethan remained in his office, making incessant calls to politicians and lawyers. "This is clearly a persecution orchestrated by environmentalists," he said on the phone, his voice laden with calculated indignation. "We need an immediate counteroffensive." August Bradford entered without knocking, his face contracted with anger. He waited for his son to end the call before exploding. "How did you let this happen? Those documents were confidential. Someone from inside leaked information to the press and to the environmental police." Ethan maintained his composure, contrasting with his father's lack of control. "Calm down, I've already identified the problem. It was that meddling lawyer, Edward Sanders. He was at the party, talking with a new journalist in town," he explained, opening a folder with photos taken during the event. "Diana Reynolds, former investigative reporter from New York. She arrived 2 months ago and is already digging into our past." August examined the photos, breathing deeply to control himself. "And what do you intend to do about it?" A cold smile formed on Ethan's lips. "The same thing we always do, Dad. First, we offer money. If that doesn't work, we find something. So to compromise her. Everyone has a skeleton in the closet," he replied, closing the folder. "As for Edward Sanders, I've already arranged for his office to receive an unpleasant visit tonight. Accidents happen, don't they?" In Edward's small law office, Diana was analyzing documents spread over an improvised table. The walls were covered with maps and photographs showing the expansion of Bradford Oil operations over the years. "These satellite images don't lie," explained Edward, pointing to dark spots in preservation areas. "The contamination is systematic and deliberate. They know exactly what they're doing." Diana nodded, absorbing the information. Her journalistic mind, however, remained intrigued by the case of the dog. "Edward, how would people react if they discovered that Ethan Bradford, the great benefactor of the town, tried to bury his own dog alive just because of an accident at a party?" "It would be devastating for his image," replied Edward, thoughtful, "but we would need concrete evidence, not just rumors, and even then, their public relations machine is powerful." "I have a source who can confirm the story," said Diana decidedly. "I just need to convince them to talk." That same afternoon, as the town was retreating to escape the heat, Peter was nervously walking the streets of Riverdale. Since the night in the brushland, he hadn't been able to sleep well. Every sound was Ethan discovering his betrayal. Every shadow was a threat. Turning a corner, he almost collided with Diana, who seemed to be waiting for him. "Mr. Peter, can we talk?" she asked directly. "About Buddy." The man turned pale, looking around like a cornered animal. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, trying to avoid her. "I know you were ordered to bury him alive and didn't do it," continued Diana, in a low but firm voice. "That was brave. And now you have the chance to do more, to expose the true nature of Ethan Bradford." Peter hesitated, the internal conflict stamped on his face, marked by sun and hard work. "He'll destroy me. He'll destroy my family," he retorted, his voice trembling. "Not if we expose him first," argued Diana, offering a card. "Think about it. You wouldn't be the only one to testify. And there's a living dog who is the living proof of his cruelty." The tension was growing in Riverdale like storm clouds on the horizon. At Bradford Ranch, an apparent climate of normality masked the agitation behind the scenes. Ethan remained impassive in public, but in private, his orders were becoming increasingly aggressive and impulsive. The absence of Buddy was noticed by the older employees, but no one dared to ask. Silence was safer than curiosity. Peter lived in a constant state of alert, divided between the fear of Ethan and the weight of his own conscience. Diana's card burned in his pocket like a live coal. Several times he picked up the phone to call, but always retreated at the last moment. "What are you thinking about, honey?" asked his wife Louise, noticing his distraction during dinner. "You've barely touched your food." "Just tired," he lied, forcing a smile. "The work at the ranch has been tough." At the veterinary clinic, Buddy was already able to walk without difficulties. The sparkle had returned to his eyes and his appetite had improved considerably. Dr. Helen observed his recovery with professional satisfaction, but also with growing concern. "We can't keep him hidden forever," she commented to Charlie, who was playing with the dog in the small yard surrounded by high walls. "Soon he'll be completely recovered and will need more space, more freedom." Charlie nodded, thoughtful. During the days of Buddy's recovery, a strong friendship had formed between the boy and the animal. It was as if both understood that they were united by an important secret. "Maybe my parents will allow him to stay with us," suggested the boy, hopeful. "I'll explain the situation and put everyone at risk," completed Dr. Helen gently. "Ethan Bradford is not a man to forgive challenges to his authority, Charlie. If he discovers that Buddy is alive, and who saved him?" The incomplete sentence hung in the air like a silent threat. The next day, the local newspaper office was buzzing with news of a mysterious fire at Edward Sanders' office during the night. Fortunately, no one had been injured, but many documents had been destroyed. "This was no accident," affirmed Edward, sitting in Diana's small office, his tired face marked by an even more intense determination. "It was a message. They want me to back off." "All the more reason to move forward," replied Diana, throwing an envelope on the table. "I got the water analyses. The contamination is even worse than we imagined, and I received an anonymous call this morning with information about other environmental crimes by Bradford Oil." Edward examined the documents, a glimmer of hope renewing his look. "This is already enough for a more robust legal action. But the Buddy case, that would humanize the whole story, show that their cruelty has no limits." "Peter still hasn't gotten back to me," sighed Diana. "I think his fear is greater than his conscience." That same afternoon, Mary found Charlie, organizing a backpack with food and clothes, assuming a suspicious attitude that immediately triggered her maternal alert. "Where are you going with all this, son?" she questioned, leaning on the doorframe. Charlie froze, caught by surprise. He hesitated for a moment, but something in his mother's understanding look made him decide he could no longer hide the truth. "Mom, I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to be angry." Mary sat on the bed, indicating that her son should do the same. "It's about that night of the party at the ranch, isn't it?" she asked softly. "You were there." Surprised by his mother's perceptiveness, Charlie nodded, and then, like a dam breaking under extreme pressure, the whole story came out. Ethan's cruel order, the journey to the brushland, Buddy's rescue, the shelter at Dr. Helen's clinic. Mary listened to everything in silence, her face alternating between horror, concern, and pride. "You risked a lot, Charlie," she finally said, hugging her son tightly. "But you did the right thing." We can't allow people like Ethan to act like this without consequences. So you're not angry? I'm concerned, but not angry, she smiled, wiping away a tear. Your father and I raised you to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. But now we need to think carefully about the next step. That night, after a long conversation with Anthony, the family decided it was time to act. They could not continue living under the shadow of fear of Ethan Bradford. The following morning, Peter was surprised to find not only Diana, but also Anthony, Mary, and Charlie waiting for him as he left work. "What is this, an intervention?" he asked nervously, looking around to make sure no one was watching them. "It's a chance to do the right thing," replied Anthony, extending his hand. "My son told me everything, Peter. You had courage that night in the brushland. Have courage. Now too." Peter looked at each face that stared at him with expectation. His gaze rested on Charlie, whose childish determination seemed stronger than the adult fear that consumed him. "If I speak," he began, his voice trembling, "I'll never get a job in this town again." "And if you don't speak," intervened Diana, "can you live the rest of your life knowing that you allowed a man like Ethan to continue destroying lives and the environment without facing consequences?" A long silence followed, heavy with possibilities and fears. Finally, Peter took a deep breath. "All right," he yielded, an invisible weight seeming to leave his shoulders. "I'll tell everything." Peter's testimony was recorded in the small improvised studio of the local newspaper. For almost 2 hours, he narrated not only the incident with Buddy, but years of abuses and irregularities he had witnessed at Bradford Ranch. His trembling hands and occasionally choked voice betrayed his emotion, but there was no hesitation in his words. "He looked me in the eyes and ordered me to bury the dog alive," reported Peter, his face pale before the camera. "He didn't even blink, as if he were asking me to throw away a broken object, not a being that had accompanied him for years." Diana conducted the interview with professionalism, but the indignation was visible in her eyes. "And it wasn't the first time you witnessed cruelty on the part of Ethan Bradford." "No," confirmed Peter, his courage increasing as he spoke. "I've seen him order employees to be beaten for small mistakes, threaten entire families with eviction for questioning work conditions. The Bradfords treat Riverdale as if it were their private property and the people as servants." At the end of the interview, Edward Sanders also presented documentation on environmental crimes. The puzzle was beginning to form, revealing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond an isolated incident with a dog. "This is going to shake the town," commented Gerald, the editor, watching the recording. "The Bradfords will react with full force." "That's why we need to release this as quickly as possible, and not just here," replied Diana. "I'm going to send it to my contacts at major newspapers and networks. The more widespread the exposure, the harder it will be for them to cover up the case." The next 48 hours were of intense work. While Diana and Edward finalized the report, Anthony and Mary organized support among former ranch employees. Charlie, in turn, continued to visit Buddy daily, telling the dog about the events as if he could understand every word. "Soon you'll be able to leave here, Buddy," promised the boy, caressing the animal's ears. "Everyone will know what happened, and Mr. Ethan will have to pay for what he did." On the morning of the third day, the local newspaper displayed on the front page, "Cruelty and Corruption, the Bradford Empire Exposed." The detailed report occupied several pages with photos, testimonies, and documents. Simultaneously, the story was conveyed in national newspapers and on social media. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Residents of Riverdale gathered at newsstands, commenting incredulously on the revelations. Phones wouldn't stop ringing at the newspaper office, with more people wanting to share their own stories of abuse by the Bradford family. At the ranch, Ethan received the news like a point-blank shot. His usually controlled face contorted into a mask of fury as he read the report, throwing objects against the wall in a fit of rage that frightened even the oldest employees. "I want all of them destroyed," he shouted, pounding the table with his fist. "That damn dog, that meddling boy, that journalist, all of them." August Bradford, unlike his son, maintained his composure. Years of tough negotiations had taught him that the worst crises required cool heads. "Control yourself, Ethan," he ordered, his voice low but authoritative. "Shouting resolves nothing. We need a strategy." "Strategy?" Ethan laughed, a humorless sound. "The strategy is to crush all of them. I have friends in the police, in the judiciary, and politics. They'll learn not to mess with the Bradfords." "Not this time," replied August, his countenance serious. "Look around you. This is different from anything we've faced before. The story is already all over the country. Our stocks are plummeting on the stock exchange. Our political friends are distancing themselves to avoid being associated with the scandal." "And what do you suggest, Dad? That we surrender?" questioned Ethan, incredulity and contempt mixed in his voice. August looked at his son for a long time, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "I suggest that you take responsibility for your actions at least once in your life," he replied coldly, "because I won't sink with you this time." The statement hung in the air like a sentence. For a moment, Ethan seemed genuinely surprised, unable to process that his father, who had always protected him and covered up his excesses, was now abandoning him. In the afternoon, the environmental police, accompanied by federal prosecutors, arrived at Bradford Ranch with search and seizure warrants. Simultaneously, the Regional Veterinary Council, alerted by Dr. Helen, sent representatives to verify allegations of animal mistreatment. At Taofu, the veterinary clinic, a small crowd formed when the news about Buddy spread. Journalists, curious residents, and animal rights activists wanted to see the dog that had survived cruelty and become a symbol of a greater struggle. Dr. Helen, a fierce protector, allowed only controlled visits. "He's not a circus spectacle," she warned severely. "He's a survivor who is still recovering." Charlie remained by Buddy's side during the visits, a comforting presence for the animal who still became frightened in crowds. The bond between the two had strengthened with each day, a friendship forged in the most unlikely circumstances. Amid the whirlwind of events, no one noticed the arrival of a dark car at the back of the clinic. From the vehicle descended a man with specific orders from Ethan, determined to eliminate the main living evidence against his boss, no matter who stood in the way. The afternoon shadows were already lengthening when Joe, the man sent by Ethan, crept through the back of the veterinary clinic. He had studied the routine of the place in the last few days and knew that was the time of least movement. Dr. Helen usually took a break for coffee, leaving only an assistant at the reception. The plan was simple: enter, find the dog, take it, or finish it on the spot, leave without being seen. What Joe didn't expect was to find Charlie sitting next to Buddy in the backyard, telling stories to the animal as if talking to a friend. Hidden behind a feed storage, Joe hesitated. Ethan hadn't mentioned anything about a child. Eliminating. The dog was one thing, but harming a boy was crossing a line that, even in his distorted morality, seemed unacceptable. While Joe was debating his moral dilemma, Thunder, Charlie's dog, came running into the yard. Always alert, the animal soon perceived the strange presence, beginning to bark furiously in the direction of the intruder. "What is it, Thunder?" asked Charlie, alarmed by the sudden agitation of the dog. Joe knew his window of opportunity was closing. In a desperate movement, he jumped from his hiding place, grabbing Buddy by the improvised collar that Dr. Helen had placed. "Hey! Who are you? Let him go!" shouted Charlie, throwing himself against the man with a courage that surprised even himself. The boy's shout alerted Dr. Helen, who came running from the office. Seeing the scene, the veterinarian did not hesitate. "Help! Thief! They're trying to take Buddy!" she shouted with all the strength of her lungs. The neighborhood, already on alert due to the commotion of the report, quickly responded to the call. Neighbors, journalists, and onlookers who were nearby ran to the clinic. Joe, realizing he was cornered, released Buddy and tried to flee, only to be restrained by a group of indignant residents. "Who sent you here?" demanded one of the men, holding Joe firmly. "It was Ethan Bradford," revealed Joe, fear overriding loyalty. "He paid me to get the dog, said it was his property." Diana, who coincidentally was interviewing a neighbor of the clinic, captured the entire confession on video. In minutes, the images were already circulating on social networks and local news. An envoy of Ethan Bradford trying to kidnap, or worse, the dog that had already become a symbol of the fight against the abuses of the family. At the police station, Joe provided complete details about the order received, including the promised amount and Ethan's explicit instructions to resolve the dog problem once and for all. The testimony was the last straw. In a few hours, a I.E. preventive arrest warrant was issued against Ethan Bradford for cruelty to animals, attempted obstruction of justice and threats. At the ranch, the siege was closing in. Court officers, accompanied by police, arrived to execute the warrant, only to discover that Ethan had disappeared. Employees reported that he had left hurriedly, taking only a small suitcase after receiving a call. August Bradford, found in his office at the company headquarters, seemed strangely resigned. "I don't know where my son went," he declared to the police, "and honestly, at this moment, I'm not sure I want to know." The search for Ethan mobilized authorities from all over the region. Roadblocks were set up, airports and bus stations received his picture. The hunt for the fugitive heir became the new focus of national attention. Meanwhile, at the veterinary clinic, now protected by police, Charlie refused to leave Buddy's side. The incident had left the dog frightened again, regressing in his emotional recovery. "Don't worry, Buddy," whispered the boy, hugging the animal that trembled slightly. "No one is going to hurt you again. I promise." Mary and Anthony observed the scene with a mixture of pride and concern. The couple had aged years in just a few days, the stress of public exposure and real danger leaving visible marks. "What do we do now?" Mary asked softly to her husband. "Charlie has become so attached to Buddy, but when all this is over—" "When all this is over," interrupted Anthony, hugging his wife by the shoulders, "we're going to need a bigger house because it seems our family has just grown." Edward Sanders, who was following the legal developments of the case, arrived at the clinic late in the afternoon with important news. "The Environmental Court has just frozen all Bradford Oil's assets," he announced to the small assembly that had formed there. "And most importantly, August Bradford has called a press conference for tomorrow. They say he's going to make surprising revelations." The news caused a stir. What could the family patriarch reveal? Would it be an attempt to save the family? Empire or the final recognition of their wrongs? "Whatever it is," commented Diana, always attentive to political nuances, "nothing will change the fact that Ethan needs to answer before justice." Night fell over Riverdale, but few could sleep. The small town, accustomed to the tranquil routine dictated by the power of the Bradfords, was now living the adrenaline of being at the center of a national scandal. In homes, bars and squares, the only subject was Ethan's escape and what August would say the next day. At the police station, Sheriff Robert Mitchell, historically allied with the Bradfords, found himself in a delicate position. The evidence against Ethan was irrefutable, the public outcry immense, and the eyes of the national press were on every movement of the local authorities. "Increase the searches at the Texas-Louisiana border," he ordered his subordinates. "And put discreet surveillance on the beach house the family has in Key West. Ethan always took refuge there when he had problems." The central square of Riverdale had never seen such a crowd. Local residents, journalists from all over the country, and curious people who had traveled especially for the event crowded in front of the improvised stage, where August Bradford would give his awaited statement. Large screens had been installed so everyone could follow, while TV stations transmitted live to millions of viewers. Punctually at 10 in the morning, August appeared, walking slowly to the microphone. At 65, always impeccably dressed, and with an upright posture, he now seemed smaller, aged, as if the weight of an entire lifetime had collapsed onto his shoulders all at once. "Good morning to all," he began, his voice firm despite the visible fatigue. "I am here today not as the president of Bradford Oil, nor as the man many consider the owner of this town. I am here as a father who failed, a businessman who lost his way, and a citizen who needs to repair his mistakes." A profound silence took over the square, interrupted only by the occasional click of photographic cameras. "For decades I built an empire based on exploitation," continued August, without consulting any notes. "Exploitation of natural resources, exploitation of workers, exploitation of laws through influence and corruption. And in the process, I created a son in my image, someone who believed himself to be above good and evil, above laws, above basic humanity. In the first rows, Edward Sanders and Diana exchanged surprised looks. No one expected such a direct and comprehensive confession. "I am not here to ask for forgiveness," August proceeded. "Some acts cannot be forgiven with words. I am here to announce concrete actions. First, from today I resign from the presidency of Bradford Oil and will hand over to the Public Prosecutor's Office all documents relating to illegal practices of the company in the last 20 years, including names of politicians and public officials involved." A murmur ran through the crowd, increasing in volume as the magnitude of the announcement was assimilated. "Second, I am transferring 50% of my shares in the company to an environmental and social compensation fund intended for the recovery of degraded areas and support for communities affected by our operations. The other 50% will be sold and the value fully donated to animal protection institutions." At the veterinary clinic, where Charlie, his parents, and Dr. Helen were watching the transmission, the astonishment was visible. "Is he really doing this?" asked Mary, incredulous. "Third," August's voice trembled slightly now, "as for my son, Ethan—" He paused, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "I spent my life protecting him from the consequences of his actions. It was my biggest mistake. As a father, I will not do it again. If you are listening to me, son, turn yourself in to the authorities. Face your responsibilities like the man I failed to raise." A heavy silence followed this statement. August seemed to have aged another 10 years in pronouncing those words. And finally, I would like to address a few words directly to young Charlie and his family. Your act of courage and compassion exposed not only my son's cruelty, but also my own negligence as a leader and as a human being. You and Buddy taught me a lesson that took me 65 years to learn, that true strength lies in protecting the most vulnerable, not in exploiting them. For this, although I do not expect your forgiveness, I offer my gratitude. With these words, August left the stage, ignoring the whirlwind of questions launched by journalists. The square exploded in excited conversations, theories, and speculations. August Bradford's public confession was an earthquake, whose waves would spread for months, perhaps years. In the afternoon, the news everyone was waiting for finally arrived. Ethan Bradford had turned himself in at a police station in Austin. According to reports, he seemed resigned, without the characteristic arrogance. He was immediately transferred to Riverdale, where he would face formal accusations. A week after Ethan's arrest, a preliminary hearing determined that he would respond in conditional freedom upon payment of a substantial bail and the surrender of his passport. The accusations were serious: cruelty to animals, environmental crimes, attempted obstruction of justice, among others, still under investigation. Upon leaving the forum, escorted by private security guards and lawyers, Ethan was received by a small crowd that protested peacefully. Among them, Charlie stood out, holding a banner that said, "Justice for Buddy and for all those who have no voice." Their gazes crossed briefly. On Ethan's face, something indefinable, shame, anger, or perhaps, for the first time, the real understanding of the impact of his actions. He quickly averted his gaze and entered the car that awaited him. The following afternoon, Charlie received an unexpected visit at the veterinary clinic. August Bradford, without the usual impeccable suit, dressed simply, asked permission to see Buddy. Dr. Helen and Charlie's parents hesitated, but the boy, after a few moments of reflection, nodded. He led the former magnate to the yard where Buddy was playing with Thunder. Upon seeing his former owner, Buddy initially backed away, distrustful. August knelt slowly, extending his hand. "Hello, old friend," he said softly. "Remember me? I used to give you treats when Ethan wasn't looking." Gradually, Buddy approached, sniffing the extended hand. After a moment of hesitation, he allowed August to caress his head. "He seems happy here," commented the man, a genuine emotion in his voice. "With people who really care. We're going to officially adopt him, explained Charlie, carefully observing the interaction. Mom and Dad have already agreed. August nodded, a sad smile on his lips. A wise decision. Buddy deserves a real family. He stood up with some difficulty, looking directly at the boy. You know, Charlie, there are people who spend their entire lives accumulating power and money, thinking that will make them happy or important. I was one of those people. But in the end, we discover that what really matters are the connections we create, the good we do, the lives we touch positively. Charlie reflected on those words for a moment. You can still change, can't you? Do good things from now on. I'll try, promised August. Although there are mistakes that cannot be completely repaired, we can always try to do better from now on. As August said goodbye, a new sensation hung over Riverdale. It wasn't exactly hope nor forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of a deeper understanding, that even in the darkest situations, compassion and courage can illuminate the path to true changes. Weeks later, when the dust began to settle, a simple ceremony took place in the newly renamed Buddy Ecological Park, previously part of the lands of Bradford Ranch. Charlie, proud, accompanied his now officially adopted four-legged friend to a commemorative plaque that told the story of a dog whose journey had inspired an entire town to wake up and fight for justice. Buddy, completely recovered and happy in his new home, ran freely through the park, oblivious to his own importance. For him, life was simple now. He had a family that loved him, space to run and play, and the security of never again being treated as disposable. And for Charlie, the most important lesson was forever engraved, that a single voice, however small, when raised for truth, can trigger waves of change capable of transforming an entire community.